If you're thinking of launching a coffee shop, it can be overwhelming to think of everything that goes into launching and running a successful cafe. Location, build out, branding, equipment, staff, operational procedures, suppliers, cash flow, and on and on. Also, figuring out how to build a compelling business plan and raising or borrowing the funds needed to get started.
So make sure that you don't piecemeal your financing and they don't borrow enough money to get through the startup phase. The odds are 60% fail in their first year. Like, do they just want to own the coffee shop and they've got enough money to hire somebody to actually run it? Or do they want to be in it day to day? And those are like, two different, very different things. You're not ready for that second location until you're not in that day to day, right? And so recognizing that you need to run a business, you're not pulling espresso shots anymore.
The right advice matters, and today I'll be interviewing Angela Vendetti, a successful coffee shop founder who started a single coffee shop called Mugshots that she grew into 5 locations and then exited by selling the business to become a restaurant advisor, influencer, and educator.
Now, we were on like prime corner and we moved a block and a half away, and I swear people would be like, oh my God, you moved like 5 blocks away. I can't walk there. That perception is so important. When they talk about retail as location, I felt like I learned a lot of things the hard way. And so my mission in my business now is to help independent restaurant owners skip the learning curve and beat the odds.
Be sure to stay to the end when Angela will share her 5 critical pieces of advice for anyone who aspires to open a successful coffee shop. Let's get into it. Today, I have a special guest on my channel, Angela Vendetti, a restaurant consultant and an entrepreneur, and we're going to hear some advice that will help you to be successful if you decide to start a coffee business. Angela, thanks for being here.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
Well, let's dive in. I think we should start with your story because you have a pretty amazing story starting coffee businesses of your own and growing them. So I'd love to just hear about your business.
Sure. So I never thought I would end up in restaurants. I'll tell you that much. I went to Drexel. I studied business and international business. I did an internship co-op in London. Thought I was going to work for this company, and I ended up getting laid off twice in 2 years. So I was originally helping a friend with a business plan for a coffee shop, and decided, hey, as soon as I got laid off the second time, I've got all the time in the world. These sales forecasts look reasonable. Why don't we do this together? And so that's kind of how we started.
That's awesome. And remind me what it's called because I'm sure people will find the kind of the backstory interesting.
Sure. So it's called Mugshots, and we actually opened 20 years ago, June 30th. So it's just crazy to me because I'm only 27, right? So back in June of 2004, we opened our first location. It was located directly across from Eastern State Penitentiary, which is a state historic site. So that's where the name came from. But we ended up opening 5 locations over a 12-year period, expanding into office catering and wholesale baked goods and sandwiches for other coffee shops.
That's awesome. And then an exit eventually, right? As far as
Yeah, so I sold the business back in 2015 and started consulting. I felt like I learned a lot of things the hard way. And so my mission in my business now is to help independent restaurant owners skip the learning curve and beat the odds. And so I have, not only do I do one-on-one consulting, but I also have a class called Restaurant Startup 101. And it's the class I wish I would have had. So it's 4 classes, about 2 hours each, access to over 20 downloads, and it's live. So it's a live virtual course that I offer, and it's really designed, again, to help you skip the learning curve and beat the odds.
That's awesome. Well, take us to the beginning with Mugshots. Like, what was day one? What did it look like? And how did you get to that first
Oh my
plateau?
gosh.
Where did it all begin?
Right. So we had a lot of hurdles. Finding a space, getting the financing. Once we found the space, we realized, and it was a great location, but we realized we had to go through zoning in the city of Philadelphia, which added about 6 months and about 10 grand in legal fees to the whole project, which is, significant. So it took us a year and a half to actually get the doors open. And we were busy day one. I mean, there was a line out the door. Of course, there was so much chatter for a year and a half that, somebody was finally opening a coffee shop in Fairmount. That was the neighborhood. And people were just, they couldn't be happier to have us there and to have an option to Starbucks, right? So, and our business was very mission based. So we had a social environmental mission. We wanted to source only fair trade organic coffee. And we built our food menu around what we could source from local farmers, which of course grew over the years, right? Like when we first started, you couldn't really get chicken unless you were buying the whole chicken. And as the food became more available and the demand for locally grown foods grew, and the distribution in Philadelphia, we were able to get more and more food delivered to us. And so our menu sort of grew from there.
Yeah. So 6 months just getting zoning and permits. What were some of the things you were doing to prepare during that time?
Oh my gosh, everything and anything. I mean, we really tried to bootstrap it, and so we did get an SBA loan, and I help my clients now with that. Like, it's really about having sound financial forecasts. Like, they're gonna read your executive summary, and then they're gonna jump to the financials, right? But having a well-rounded plan that really details out the menu, the marketing plan, and having that cash flow analysis for 2 years by month, right? And making sure that the banker understands what your cash flow assumptions are, right? How did you get to your sales forecasts,
Mm.
right? And working in all of the expenses and everything. So we borrowed initially $100,000, and what we realized, and I coach my clients on this now, is that your construction budget is usually going to go over, right? So you could probably add about 30 to 50% to whatever that initial budget was, depending on how old the building is and can of worms that you open up when you start.
Wow.
Um, but also the timeline. It just sometimes takes a lot longer. And so you need to plan for that. And so we ended up going a little bit over that 100,000, and luckily had good credit and had access to lines of credit. So we were able to um, fill the gap there. But we were, finding suppliers. I actually, because I was unemployed, I got laid off. I was eligible for a program through the state of Pennsylvania. And I took it through WRC, the Women's Opportunities Resource Center. And completing that program, which was about getting your business plan done, and we had access to some financing there. So that was like a really good way to help us like focus and get the plan done and really do a thorough job in the planning process. um, one of the things that we really didn't think too much about or understand completely was how many people we would need,
Yeah.
right? And that really came down to the operation. So understanding like we weren't just serving coffee, we also opened as a juice bar. So we had a juice station, and then we also were making bagel sandwiches, and we had a food station.
Wow.
And it grew from there. We started, baking all of our own baked goods and everything like that. So my one location, we had about 35 employees. Um, at the peak of the business, I probably, with 3 locations, I had over 50 employees.
Wow.
That was quite a lot.
Yeah, that's quite a thing. Like, well, how long did it take until you really felt like the business was profitable? And then maybe even beyond that, like at what point do you feel like you kind of hit the break even point with your initial investment?
We hit our sales forecast out of the park. So, and we were lucky, right? Like not everybody starts out that way. So I initially had forecasted, and the way that I figured out the sales forecast, right, is I went to a similar establishment not that far from where we were opening. And I sat there and I counted the number of people that walked in throughout the day
Yeah.
and figured out what the average transaction was. And I came up with, okay, I think we're probably going to do about $700 or $800 a day. Well, we doubled that on like day one. So it was clear that we needed more staff, right, immediately, and that our sales forecasts were we were just doing really well. It was really about understanding the financials and managing the costs. That's what we sort of figured out. And so what happens is when you have this sort of volume, it masks problems, right?
Yeah.
So it's like as long as you feel like you're getting paid, what you think you should be getting paid, right? You don't really dig any deeper. But usually when I come into a client project, I'll uncover opportunities to put more money in your pocket. And that took a little while to like really understand the financials of the business, understand how to manage and track those costs on a weekly basis. And that's what I teach my clients to do now. But we made so many mistakes. Like if we had opened and weren't at our sales forecast, I guarantee you like it never would have lasted.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'd like to hear about two different things you started to talk about there, just the labor side of it and then the financial side of it. But what did you do like when you realized, oh, we're going to have a lot, we're going to need a lot more people? what did that look like, and how did you kind of work through that and get to a point where you were like, okay, now we've got the right staff levels?
Right. Yeah, I think it was like, so understanding those different stations that I mentioned, right? So it's like, okay, well, we need somebody at the register to take orders. We need somebody on the espresso machine to make drinks. We need somebody to make food. And this is what I kind of coach my clients on now. It's like, sometimes, like, if you're, unless you're really confident about that sales volume, adding a food operation to your coffee house business can really complicate things and make it a lot more expensive to run. And so you want to, how can you offer a snack or a little bit of food without adding so much labor, right? Because right there and then you needed at least three people, right? We could have like the juice wasn't as popular. In fact, we got rid of it within 2 years. We were like, forget it. Like, this isn't worth it. It's too bulky. It's only 10% of our sales. It just puts a wrench in the whole operation as soon as somebody orders a juice. And we actually went to smoothies instead and figured out a way to do it quickly at the barista bar. So like where the espresso machine was, we could have the blender and make the smoothies there. So that kind of cut down on, the required labor that was there day to day. But yeah, it was like unreasonable to think that you were going to have somebody on making drinks and be able to run to the back and make a juice,
Yeah.
right? And then also realizing that during peak times, one person couldn't make all of that food. So we needed to have like two or three people on the line, making the food, and two people making the espresso drinks. So then it was like, okay, now we have to adjust our training program. How do we train people to work two people on the espresso bar?
Yeah.
Right. Which, so that they're not running into each other. Right. So it's basically one person is setting up the shots, the other person is pouring the milk and calling out the drink.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think it's interesting, where it's almost like this whole other layer of what I call like iterative product development, because each product has its own, let's develop what it is, how we describe it, how we price it, those kinds of things. But it's almost like adding another product isn't just iterating a new product. It's now you're iterating, how do we get both of these products to work in tandem? And then, and then even dealing with the space side of it, it kind of reminds me of the movie The Founder, when they're on the tennis court, trying to pretend how the McDonald's flow of things would happen and figure out like who's going to bump into who. And, because you have all these different things happening at once. And so it's that
right.
coordination effort.
Right.
I can see how that would be really
It's funny you mentioned that. So I ended up having to relocate that original location. So, somebody else bought the building. We fell out with the landlord. I decided, that's it. I'm just going to relocate. So I moved a block and a half away back in 2012. And when I did that, I redesigned the space so that it was much more efficient and more customer friendly and required fewer employees. So I went from 35 employees to 20, and my labor costs like came down quite a bit because of how that was redesigned. We also lost some sales. Now we were on like prime corner, right? Like it was like a really, really great corner. And we moved a block and a half away. And I swear people would be like, oh my God, you moved like 5 blocks away. I can't walk there.
Yeah.
It's like a block and a half. Like, so that perception, right? And on the other side of the street, right? That perception is so important. When they talk about retail as location, that's what they're talking about. We were on a corner and it wasn't busy at the time. It was an apartment. It was dark. We turned it from an apartment into this, bustling corner because of the coffee shop. But it also was at 21st Street, which ran south into Center City. So this was like a popular route for walkers, bikers, people driving to get into Center City. But that location was so important. But even though I lost 30% of my sales overnight, right, when I made that move, my business was more profitable in that new location because I was able to run it more efficiently. The rent was definitely cheaper. It was less than half the price, but it was really more about that labor cost. And then we were also able to add a different profit center because we built a bigger kitchen. So that's where the catering came in. So by the time I sold the business, catering was 25% of the total business.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and that's just interesting of like finding, once you have this business platform, once you have this starting point, then finding other, just other ways to build on that platform with other business types, product types, services, and so forth.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
talk a little bit about the finance, because I think what's interesting is what I'm hearing you say is like, even if everything else is running well, you're going to be, on one hand, it may seem successful. You've got a lot of money coming in, but ultimately it's, what's the profit margin? How well you manage the margin is a big part of the success. So talk a little bit about kind of that growth process and that learning curve over time.
Yeah. So when we first really started tracking our cost of goods sold, so this is your product cost, right? We were up close to 40%. And when I realized that the industry benchmark was between 25 and 30%, I thought, this is a big deal. This is a problem. And what we decided, like for our business, and I do this with my clients now, like I stack them up against the industry benchmark, and then we set a goal for what's reasonable for the business, right? And for us, again, because we were buying from local farms, right? We weren't a sit down BYOB where we could charge $35 or $40 a plate. We were still a coffee shop serving breakfast sandwiches and lunch, and the price sensitivity was there for that. We had that fast casual price point that we had to meet. And so we decided that 35% was acceptable for us. And that's what we strove for. But it was really all about tracking it on a weekly basis. So, implementing a system that allowed us to isolate those costs. And this is before QuickBooks Online. But even with QuickBooks Online, it's still not perfect, right? Because sometimes some vendors you're paying cash, some you're paying, you have terms with, some you're buying with a credit card, right? So how can you isolate all of those purchases in 1 week? And when you do that, you on average improve your net profit margin by 5 points.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. We were able to really improve our net profit margin by tracking those costs and really, really understanding the financials. I went to school for business. Like I understood, I did all of the bookkeeping until I got to 3 locations. I was like, I don't have time for this. And it was a lot. So I hired a bookkeeper. But making sure that you have like those accurate, timely reports so that you can manage your business better is really what's important. And understanding what those industry benchmarks are, how you stack up, and setting reasonable goals is how you do better.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I've heard you say, some of the big levers to pull when it comes to cost management relate to like labor, cost of goods, any others, and maybe just a little more detail on how those impact it.
Yeah. So a big one that I'm seeing right now that can really be make or break is, and this is true at the beginning when you're financing, and also like as you grow, how you finance your growth, but making sure that your financing works with your cash flow.
Mm.
I can't tell you how many people I meet who are drowning in debt because they've taken advantage of these cash advances from their credit card companies,
Mm.
whether it's Square or Toast or some other, credit card company. They see your deposits going in every day and they pre-approve you for a loan. And it's very easy. It's within 24 hours. It's one click, right? But it doesn't work with cash flow. First,
Yeah.
you're paying like an exorbitant amount of interest up front. So usually it's like 15% or more up front. You pay it right off the bat. And then they're taking anywhere between 8 and 20% of your daily deposits. Well, like I show my clients my benchmark pie chart, right? Where the average net profit margin in the business is 7%. Where's this 20% coming from?
Yeah.
It doesn't work. It does not work. And so I see people drowning in it. And once you're in that situation, it's kind of hard to refinance it.
Right.
So you end up being in this boat where you're, cash poor for, the 6 or 8 months or whatever. That's the problem. It's a very short payback period. So they're taking a lot off the top to get the loan paid. And it doesn't work. It's easy to get money. It is not always easy to pay it back. So
Mm.
make sure that you don't piecemeal your financing, first of all, right? So, oh, well, I have a line of credit over here, and then I've got a credit card, and I can do a home equity loan, right? That creates the same problem. You've got a monthly debt service that doesn't work with your cash flow,
Yeah.
and it'll drown you.
Yeah, I find it's so important to have a relationship with a banker as an entrepreneur, and
Yeah.
not for the reasons everybody thinks. Everybody thinks you need to know a banker in case you need to set up an account, or maybe you need to ask for a loan. It's so much more than that. It's like having that relationship. They know you, they understand the business. The ones that are really servicing small businesses well do get into
Hmm.
like, how does this business work, and can give advice on that whole, like, what's the right way to line these up, or what are you doing now that's going to have an impact on what you're trying to do now, or here are some options. Yeah, I've just found that that can be such an important relationship and way beyond just the like mechanics of setting up an account and those kinds of things.
Yeah, definitely. And with a community bank, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
makes a big difference.
So, so I'd be interested to know about just the growth side of it. So you got one coffee shop going and it was successful, and then you know work your way up to three, four, five. What were some of the things that you did to prepare to have a second location, and then maybe what looked different as you went to like location 4, location 5?
Right, right. So, there's things that we did to prepare, and then there's things that I wish I would have done differently, right?
Sure.
That's that's what, working with me, it's like you get the benefit of all of that. All of like the little mistakes that I made that I really wish I would have done differently. But one of the things that we did right, I think, and it was probably, I have this manager to thank. His name's Kelly Simmons. I don't know where he is in the world now, but he came to us. We hired him, and he really kind of sold himself as a manager. He's like, what you guys really need is a manager. And he knew the business. He was great with the staff.
Mm,
And he is really what enabled us to get out of the day to day so that we could focus on that growth. Now, when we decided to open our second location, the first one was, immediate success in Fairmount. We didn't replicate the success that we had, right? We could have done a lot more market research to find a similar neighborhood and a
mm.
similar zip code, demographic, all of that. And what we did is we kind of went the easy route. So we had actually gone out to Narberth to look at a space out there, talked to the guy at the municipal building, and he was like, look, all the restaurants got together and they decided they don't want any more restaurants here. So it's going to be next to impossible for you to take this boutique shop and turn it into a restaurant. And I was like, I'm not going through that again, right? Like all the zoning, it was brutal. And so on the way home, we stopped to have lunch at a place. It was called Grassroots Cafe in Manioc on Cotton Street, and realized that it had closed and there was a for rent sign up. And we were like, oh my gosh, we should open here. And
Yeah.
so we called the number on the sign, and we met with them, and we signed a lease like a week later. And
Nice.
it was turnkey, right? Like we didn't have to do a lot of work. We just rebranded it, put our sign up and everything. But it was not the right space for us. It was not replicating what we had. It was a completely different market. And so I think that one was open for about 6 years before I just decided, it's my partner and I split up. And so without her there in the business, I wasn't really making any money.
Yeah.
Right. So decided to close it down and actually took all of the equipment and tried to open up a spot at Temple University. And that had limited success. Now, the lure there was the landlord was paying for everything,
Mm,
right? So they were going to cover the fit out. All I had to do was move my equipment over there. And it was inside a new international student dorm. And the people were lovely. I mean, I would highly recommend the landlord. They were great to work with, but it was a little too far west on Cecil B. Moore. There was a Dunkin' Donuts and a 7-Eleven, and there was Saxby's, I think, on Leocoris Walk, probably a Starbucks somewhere. I don't remember, but there was just a lot of competition on
a
top
lot of
of.
places people could stop before they ever got to you. It sounds like.
Right, right, from the subway, right? There was no reason that they were walking, that far west.
Yeah.
And so it was more of an amenity, and I would caution people about this. Like people will come to you and ask you to open locations because it is a great amenity having a coffee shop in your building. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make money, right? Because that's what people saw it as. They saw it as inside that building. You had to go through a turnstile type door to get in. It didn't really have its own retail entrance. So again, talking about location, 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 this was not an ideal location. I think it was worth trying it out. I learned a lot, right? Didn't
Yeah.
cost me anything. But ultimately, I think it was open for about a year before I closed it.
Yeah. So it sounds
Yeah.
like some of the things with growth, number one was getting a really competent leader in place who could run the day to day of the current one, kind of freeing you
Hmm.
and your partner up to start to look at expansion locations. And then
Hmm.
what are some of the things you did did you get to a point where you had more of like a template, or how did you figure
Hmm.
out how you wanted to move to the additional locations along the way?
Yeah, I mean, we documented our systems to the nth degree. I think that was, with an eye on like, could we franchise this,
Mhm.
And I think we decided that like because we were so hyper local and using a lot of, our menu was curated from what we could get locally, that it wasn't really franchisable. We sort of moved away from that as an idea. We wanted it to be more unique. We wanted to have the flexibility to change things depending on where we were as well. Um, but yeah, I mean, documenting the hiring process, hiring and training, documenting, so like when I had the 3 locations open at one time, I had managers in each location and we had managers meetings every week. So we were communicating on all of the benchmarks that we needed to stay on top of. And it wasn't just cost of goods and labor and sales, it was also, what's coming up? Like, do we have any events coming up? What's in our marketing plan right now? Right. Any kind of personnel issues, repairs and maintenance, right? So we covered everything A to Z in these weekly meetings just to kind of stay on top of things. So, um, there's a lot of things that like I said, I wish I would have done differently with the growth, but it was a really great exploratory experience, I would
Yeah.
say.
What are a couple of your biggest learnings from, that growth stage, kind of going from 1 to 5 restaurants?
Right. So I mean, so one of the things is like I definitely recommend reading this book. So the E-Myth, you can see I've got tons of notes in here.
Definitely.
And I'm sure you recommend this too,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
So that's really like you're not ready for that second location until you're not in that day to day, right? And so recognizing that you need to run a business, you're not pulling espresso shots anymore, right? So, getting out of the day to day, really focusing on the financials, negotiating good lease agreements,
Mm.
right? So that's something I learned the hard way. Don't let anybody walk away with your signature on something without getting their signature.
Mm.
And that's kind of what happened to me. Um, that was a really really tough lesson that threw me into litigation for over 3 years and cost me about 80,000 in legal fees.
Wow.
Oh, I got some doozies up my sleeve here.
Okay. Get the contract signed. That's what I'm hearing.
Get the contract signed. Yes, definitely. Really understanding like how much it's going to cost to get open,
Mhm.
right? So, one of the locations I opened, I did with grant money, and that was fantastic. Now, I'd caution you against that because generally speaking, the grant money is aimed at areas that aren't quite there yet, right? And so you might not have the customer base to really support your concept, right? So, this was a grant from the Merchants Fund. It was a matching grant. The landlord kicked in the other half. And again, I think I maybe spent $10,000 on top of that to get this location open. Well, it was half a block from my house, right? So I had an interest in seeing this area become more vibrant, right?
Mm.
I wanted to see, this was on Girard Avenue, and there's still a coffee shop there now called The Monkey and the Elephant, which is a nonprofit that works with kids coming out of the foster care system
Oh,
and
nice.
kind of trains, does some job training. It's a great business. um, but that location was like I knew I wasn't going to have the foot traffic there, and so again I sort of changed the concept a little bit. In hindsight, I wish I would have just rebranded it because people's expectations were that you could get sandwiches made to order and that it would be the same exact menu, and I
Right.
couldn't do that there. I didn't have the space. I knew I wasn't going to have the foot traffic, and so you know, it ended up being a little bit different. But when the lease term was up and it was up for renewal, again, I wish I would have negotiated that renewal option a little bit better because they wanted to raise the rent. It's like I'm still not putting money in my pocket,
Yeah.
right? So why am I gonna, continue to pay you? And this was back in 2010. So I mean it was a long time ago. So I made the decision to shut it down.
Mm.
I had just relocated on Fairmount Avenue, and I needed to focus on my bread and butter. So it was a tough decision, but ultimately, I think it was the right one.
Yeah. That's great. So
Mhm.
maybe moving on to kind of the next phase of your journey, because in a lot of ways you went from creating value and creating restaurants and growing them and growing coffee shops, and now kind of the shift to becoming a restaurant consultant. So talk about some
Mhm.
of the things that you're doing now to help others follow in your footsteps that, maybe don't have a lot of background but want to start a coffee business of some sort.
Sure. So I work with independent operators on startup profitability and quality of life. And so, the startup process, I work with mostly local folks, understanding Philadelphia zoning, health department, looking for locations, getting the financing, and project managing the open. I'll give you an example. I just worked with a client that opened in December, and it was a big project, a big renovation project. And so usually you'll work with an architect and then you'll have a kitchen designer come in and design the kitchen. Well, they like severely over designed this kitchen. I mean, I knocked like 150 grand off the cost of this kitchen just by looking at it and saying, okay, we don't need custom metal. We can just do work tables, and we don't need the $25,000 oven. We can, do just fine with this one, right? So there's definitely, it more than paid for my services over the course of a year, that's for sure. So I try to, make sure that there's a lot of value in what I'm offering by skipping that learning curve, beating the odds, right? The odds are 60% fail in their first year.
Yeah.
Right. So it isn't a great success rate. And the biggest reason for that is that people they don't finance their business correctly, right? And they don't borrow enough money to get through the startup phase. So making sure that we have enough working capital built in there to get through that startup phase. And the other thing is a contingency. I always put 10% contingency in that plan, because you never know what's going to happen when they start knocking down walls and uncovering what happened in the restaurant prior or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I help them with the startup phase. I help them with profitability. So that's really about financial literacy. Your accountant doesn't necessarily know. I mean, they're all about tax compliance. And your bookkeeper should be giving you timely reports. But outside of that, how can you manage your business, right? By tracking your costs on a weekly basis to help improve that net profit margin. So putting those systems in place to really understand what those costs are and how to track them and how to manage your business so that you can improve them. It's really, really important. Your accountant doesn't necessarily know how to run a restaurant,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then the quality of life piece is really all about delegation. So I'll work with managers. So when you're at that point, when you're ready to open the second location, right? You need to get a manager in place so that you can focus on that growth. So I'll work with you and your manager, set up an incentive plan for them to reach cost and sales goals. And then we'll work on a weekly basis, right? How making sure that they are on track to reach that incentive, right? So usually it's a quarterly bonus. They every week they know that they're on track to reach that quarterly bonus or a percentage of that quarterly bonus, because they have the right tools to manage the business.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's good. So now I know you also have some things available for those that are maybe dipping their toe in the water with restaurants, but aren't ready or aren't financially able to hire your full services. Maybe talk to us a little bit about your online program.
sure. And this is something that came out of COVID, right? Like, didn't everybody's business, the whole world turned upside down, right? And so I do coaching with the Community College of Philadelphia, their Power Up program, and they asked me to put together a program called Restaurant Best Practices. And so I did that and, ran it a couple times. And I'm like, this is great. I love doing this. I really felt like I was able to reach a lot of people. There's like 20 or 30 people that show up to each class. And I decided to put together my own class. So specifically for startups. And so it's called restaurantstartup101.com. You can go to my website and check it out. And it's 4 classes designed to help you skip the learning curve and beat the odds. It is the class I wish I had. I probably wasn't going to hire a consultant, but I definitely would have paid for this class. And I probably would have skipped a lot of those mistakes.
Yeah. And those are actually live engagements. They're not just like pre-recorded information. You're actually doing these live, right?
Yes. So it's so we figure out a time that works for you, and we meet for 2 hours each week for 4 weeks in a row, and then you also have access to download. So throughout the class, we're talking about all different types of tools that you need for whether it's inventory or staffing, um, tracking those costs on a weekly basis, management incentive plans, right? So that's all in the folder, the download that you get when you sign up for the class.
Yeah, that's great. That's
Yeah.
excellent. So anything new in the hopper, anything up and coming that you're working on that you want to reveal today?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Actually, I'm working on training programs. So it's an app-based training. It's almost like a language program.
Yeah.
And so basically you have like, let's say a barista path, right? And so when you hire a barista, you give them this app, they log in. You can, as a manager, you can see how far they're getting in the app, right? And you would set up like policies, right? Handbook policies, menu, espresso, right? And you could break the espresso down into different parts. So it'll probably be broken down into, parts of the machine and maintenance, and then pulling shots and the grind, and then steaming milk, right? So we have like all of these different modules broken down, and as soon as they get through that initial training, they start the hands on. And
Nice.
I think it's going to provide a really good foundation to get people comfortable. That's like a big reason why people leave in the first couple of weeks, is that they don't feel comfortable. The industry is notorious for just like throwing you the apron. Here you go, clock in, right?
Right.
Really getting comfortable, knowledgeable before they're actually in front of customers is super important for morale, for customer satisfaction, and for turnover.
I love that. And so that would be a service you'd provide to the restaurant, and they'd be able to use it to onboard and train or
Yeah.
upskill their employees. That's awesome. I love that.
Yes. Yeah. I'm looking forward. I just need a little bit more time to
Yeah, right.
to
So
pull this together.
coming
I'm
soon.
working on it.
The wait list will maybe there's a wait list we can put a sign up sheet for down below. That's
Great
awesome.
idea.
Yeah. So kind of bringing this all together, what would be if someone's in their job thinking, I'm tired of kind of grinding it out. I want to go and do something different in my life. And I would love to, I mean, everybody loves going to the coffee shop in the morning. I'd love to start my own coffee business. What advice would you have for them?
Um, that's a great question. I love working with these people, by the way, like, because I was that person. I was the person that got laid off from my corporate job and thought, oh my gosh, this would be so cool to open a coffee shop, right? And it's a lot different than it looks from the outside, right? One of the questions I put on my application was, why do you want to work at Mugshots, right? And if somebody answered, it looks like a really chill job, that was going in the maybe pile, right? Because it was so much work. It was really hard work. So I think, I would definitely start with like asking them what their expectations are in terms of day to day. Like, do they just want to own the coffee shop and they've got enough money to hire somebody to actually run it? Or do they want to be in it day to day? And those are like, two very different things. And then what are your expectations in terms of income? What are your personal income goals with it? So some people I talk to are like making that career switch, right? And they have maybe the 401k to borrow from, or the money to throw at it. But they still need to make money. It's not like they're, in early retirement, right? So let's be realistic about that. And I like to get people into a feasibility project first, right? So before we start on a 6-month startup engagement, let's talk feasibility. And that's really essentially like half the business plan, right? So let's do the market research on the concept and the market, and then let's talk about, let's do the financial forecasts and get real comfortable with it. Conservative sales forecasts, right? And then, how do you feel about this, right? So you want to get real comfortable with losing money for the first 6 months, right?
That sounds
Or
very uncomfortable to me, but I
right,
know what
yeah, yeah.
you're
Or
saying.
probably borrowing more than you thought you needed to borrow. When I talk to people that are like, I've got $30,000 saved, I'm like, well, that's good enough for the down payment for the loan that you're going to need, but it's not going to get you there. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, any do you have specific points of advice you might give?
Yeah. So I mean, there's really like, 5 things that I would say that you really need to consider before you start on this venture, right? One is make sure you borrow enough money, right? Look at that cash flow, do the cash flow analysis, make sure you're comfortable with the sales forecasts. And again, don't piecemeal the financing, right? So that cash flow is super important. So when you're building that pro forma, right, it's not a P&L because you've got to factor in your full loan payment. And the bank is going to look for your debt service coverage ratio. And so you want it to be 1.25 or higher, right? So that's one of the things that we look for when we do this feasibility and put together these financial forecasts. Again, how much money do you want to make, right? So what are your personal income goals for this project? Let's get super realistic about that. Understanding the industry benchmarks, right? So I just started working with a client today and I asked for their P&Ls. Luckily they had them. So they are doing the right thing. They've got a bookkeeper, they've got an accountant. Sometimes they start and people just don't have any of that. And we got to kind of back up a little bit. But they thought they needed marketing. I'm like, if you had your costs under control, you wouldn't think that you needed marketing. Now, they have seen a sales slump, so we also need marketing, but there's two sides to the equation here, right? So really understanding the industry benchmarks and how to track those prime costs on a weekly basis. Understanding hospitality, right? Like that is something, like I said, I never thought I'd end up in the restaurant business. I did bus tables when I was in college, but I didn't want to serve tables. Like I didn't even want to talk to people, right? So, and this was only, like 5 years later. So I mean, I wasn't like that much more mature than I was in college. And it took me a long time to sort of, have that sense of hospitality. And so another book I would recommend is Setting the Table by Danny Meyer, who is a famous restaurateur in New York City, right? But really understanding hospitality and the stories that he tells and how he goes above and beyond are just amazing. The other thing is treat your employees right, especially now, right? They have choices. During COVID, we lost 25% of the workforce in the hospitality industry, and we're still trying to get them back. Now, the good news is I have seen some people come back, right? They went and, took this $1,000 bonus that Amazon was offering and, worked in a warehouse for a while. And lo and behold, somebody that thrives in the restaurant industry doesn't exactly fit in a warehouse, right? Yeah. So they're coming back, but they're also coming back because I think restaurant owners have really come to realize that culture is important. So really focusing on that culture. And one more book I'll recommend is Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. Yeah. Really, really great book. Yeah. So I just, I was like in that mindset. I'm like, how about you just come to work and I pay you, right? Yeah. And they need a little bit more than that. And I'm glad. And, when I first started, my partner was more into HR training. I was more focused on financials, marketing, operations. And so when we separated 5 years into it, I realized I had to focus on the people. And I'm glad I did. I did. It was really rewarding to really grow those relationships. And I still have, good friends and folks that I talk to this day that used to work for me and really think, I mean, I know I changed just being able to see what an impact I've had on their life, but just having a better environment to work in, right? So, I mean, instead of walking through the door and identifying everything that's wrong and out of place, like walking in and saying good morning, yeah. Smiling, right. Hey, thanks for doing this, right? Showing appreciation goes a really, really long way.
Yeah. So. Any suggestions just about someone who's thinking about, should I go into this on my own or should I partner with someone? Obviously a lot of dynamics there, just some things, any suggestions of things to think about?
Yeah. I would say, if you're going to find a partner, find out, figure out, really understand what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and find a partner that complements you, right? Yeah. That's really what's going to make it a good partnership. Make sure that you have, the same vision. And also make sure that you have a good exit strategy. Another thing I learned the hard way, right? So we took advantage of the free legal clinic and, we didn't end up having a good exit strategy when it came down to it. So if I'm working with a partnership, I usually will send them, especially in a startup situation, right, before they really completed their operating agreement, I will send them a list of considerations that lawyers tend not to think about or don't really know about because they're not in the real world, entrepreneurial situation all that often, right? So, what happens when one person wants out? I mean, you've heard of the 4Ds, right? So, but sometimes it's just like, I don't like you anymore, right? Now what? and it can't be a hostage situation. Like there needs to be some kind of trigger to evaluate the company, get the financing. What happens if you can't get the financing? Right. So think through all of those scenarios. And if you want the list, I'd be happy to share it. Because it all was, from experience. Like all of the things I wish were in my operating agreement that were not.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
really good. That's really helpful. So if someone's watching this and thinking, wow, I really need to reach out to Angela and engage your services, or there's interest in Restaurant Startup 101, what are some ways folks can get a hold of you?
Sure. So you can reach me on LinkedIn, Angela Vendetti. Instagram is Angie.Vendetti. And on Facebook is Restaurant Startup 101. And of course, my website is angelavendetti.com.
That's excellent. Well, Angela, thanks so much for being here. Actually, before we go, I always like to ask, what is your favorite founder film?
I love Euro Dreams of Sushi. That is something that you introduced me to. And I just think it's fantastic. I recommend it all the time.
Oh yeah, one of my favorites as well. I mean, one of the only sushi chefs in all of time to date to get a 3 Michelin star rating, and small sushi shop in a subway station in Tokyo. And but what a beautiful film of just seeing the rigor and the kind of the endless striving towards mastery, and like creating that almost like that succession approach of like teaching someone to become a master at it and keeping the business
Hmm.
going. And just such a powerful story. I like that one. That's a great one.
Yeah, me too.
Well, good. Well, Angela, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate having you here and just hearing about all the ways you have been brewing success in your background. So.
Well, thank you, John. I'm happy to be here. Happy to share.
If you're thinking of launching a coffee shop startup, click on the link below for Angela's masterclass, Restaurant Startup 101. Also, to learn more about successfully launching a coffee startup, check out my series called How to Launch a Coffee Biz. Keep going.